What, I assume you had a pretty driving ambition. You obviously knew maybe at 6, I'm going to make it to the top, I'm going to be a star.
Absolutely.
Okay.
I was sure of it.
What? You and Mom were sure of it.
Yes.
What was behind that ambition? Obviously, you weren't one of the...
Diahann Carroll's story is one of them. She stepped into the world of entertainment at a time when the doors she needed to walk through were often locked, bolted, and guarded by people who believed someone like her had no place on the other side. Yet, she walked through anyway. She did it with grace, courage, and a determination so fierce that it changed the shape of American television forever. To the world, she was a pioneer, a woman whose elegance lit up every room, whose voice carried a quiet conviction that demanded respect. People admired the poise, the sophistication, the confidence, but what they did not always see was what it cost her. They did not see the weight of being the first, of carrying hope for so many who had never seen themselves reflected on a screen. They did not see the loneliness that often comes with breaking barriers, nor the emotional wounds she carried long before she ever stood beneath a spotlight. Her rise looked effortless to the audience watching from a distance, but nothing about Diahann's early path was easy. Each step was shaped by the expectations placed on her as a young black woman in a world that insisted on shrinking her. There were moments when she questioned herself, moments when she felt pulled between the pressure to stay quiet and the need to claim her place. Yet she kept choosing to move forward, even when the ground beneath her felt unsteady. She became a symbol of possibility. She became proof that representation was not just important, but necessary. But symbols are not immune to pain. Even as she reached new heights, she faced battles the public did not see. Discrimination, personal heartbreak, a constant fight to protect her dignity in an industry that often tried to control or diminish her. Still, she stood tall. She kept giving the world performances filled with truth, complexity, and warmth. Diahann Carroll was more than a star. She was a force of change. And like all forces, her story carries both power and vulnerability. Behind the beauty, behind the acclaim, behind the iconic roles, there was a woman who had lived through loss, resilience, survival, and transformation. Tonight, we look past the glamour and uncover the path she walked, a path marked by courage, sacrifice, and the quiet determination to be seen. This is the real story of Diahann Carroll, not just the legend, but the woman who fought, who dreamed, who struggled, and who ultimately changed everything.
Origins and family roots. Diahann Carroll was born Carol Diane Johnson in 1935 in the heart of Harlem, a place filled with music, pride, and struggle. Her parents were hardworking people who carried their own quiet dreams. Her mother, Mabel, was a nurse's aide. Her father, John, was a subway conductor. They were ordinary in the way extraordinary people often appear before history reveals their full story. They raised her daughter with a deep belief in discipline, dignity, and self-respect, even when the world outside did not offer those things freely to families like theirs. The Johnson home was modest, but it was built on structure and ambition. Diahann grew up surrounded by the rhythms of Harlem, where jazz floated out of windows and the energy of the city shaped the spirit of young people who dared to imagine more for themselves. But her parents understood the dangers and instability of the world she was growing up in, so they tried to shield her as much as they could. They wanted her to aim high, but they also knew how easily a dream could be crushed. That awareness stayed with her for the rest of her life. When Diahann was still a young child, her family temporarily moved to North Carolina so she could be cared for by relatives while her parents struggled to secure stability. Those early separations left a quiet mark on her. She learned early how fragile security could be, how easily life could shift, and how quickly a child could be expected to adapt. Yet even then, she carried a presence that people noticed. She spoke carefully. She observed everything. Her teachers saw potential before she even understood what that meant. The family returned to New York, and soon the world around her began to open in small but meaningful ways. Her parents enrolled her in schools where she could develop her mind and her talents. There was pride in her household, pride in knowing that their daughter might achieve something they never had the chance to reach. But expectations can be heavy, even when rooted in love. Diahann felt both the encouragement and the pressure, understanding that her success was not just for herself, but for the sacrifices her parents had made. Her roots were shaped by both Harlem's vibrancy and her family's quiet resilience. Those two influences would eventually merge in her career, creating the unique blend of elegance, strength, and emotional depth that audiences would come to know so well. Behind her future stardom were the lives of two parents who worked long hours, believed fiercely in their child, and hoped she would rise above the limits placed in her path. Their dreams became the soil where hers first took shape, grounding her long before she ever stepped onto a stage or faced a camera.
Childhood struggles and early influences. Diahann's childhood was shaped by contradictions. On one hand, she was surrounded by culture, music, and art that poured out of Harlem's streets. On the other, she was navigating a world marked by racial boundaries, expectations, and subtle messages that tried to define what she could or could not become. Even as a girl, she felt the tension between possibility and limitation. Her earliest struggle was understanding where she fit. She was quiet, thoughtful, and observant, a child who carried her emotions inward. She watched the adults around her push through exhaustion and hardship, pretending the weight did not hurt as much as it did. That awareness shaped her ability to read people, a skill that later gave her performances such striking emotional honesty. Music became her first refuge. She sang at church, in school, and anywhere someone would let her. It came naturally, almost like breathing. When she performed, she felt free in a way that everyday life did not allow. Her teachers noticed the talent immediately. They encouraged her to apply to the High School of Music and Art, a place where gifted children learned discipline, technique, and the hard truth that talent alone was not enough. Getting accepted was a turning point, but it came with its own challenges. She often found herself one of the only black students in rooms where she felt the weight of being watched, judged, or underestimated. She learned quickly that she had to be better than good. She had to be exceptional, polished, and prepared at all times. That pressure became part of her identity. She carried herself with a controlled grace because she feared one misstep could confirm someone's worst assumptions about her. It was a painful awareness for someone so young, yet it sharpened her resolve. Her childhood was also marked by a deep desire to prove her worth. That desire pushed her toward excellence, but it also carved out a private loneliness. She felt like she lived in two worlds, the world of her dreams and the world that reminded her those dreams were too ambitious for a girl like her. But she did not stop reaching. She kept singing. She kept studying. She kept imagining a life where she could stand in the light without apology.
First steps into career. Diahann's first steps into the world of performance began quietly, almost shyly, long before she ever imagined herself on a stage. She was still a teenager in Harlem, trying to figure out who she was supposed to become, when her singing voice started turning heads. It was the kind of voice people paused to listen to. It carried warmth, clarity, and a surprising strength for someone so young. She didn't think of it as a gift at first. It felt more like a small doorway out of the noise and struggle around her, something she could hold on to when everything else felt uncertain. Her mother noticed it before she did. She pushed her gently toward local auditions, never forcing but always encouraging. Diahann was hesitant. She carried the insecurities of a black girl growing up in a world that constantly told her she wasn't enough. But the moment she stood in front of a microphone, something inside her settled. She knew she belonged there. Her first real break came when she entered and won a talent competition at the Apollo Theater. Suddenly, people were paying attention. She was offered small gigs, nightclub performances, and local radio spots. None of it paid much, but it lit a spark. Every night she performed, she felt a little braver. She started to dream bigger, though she kept most of those dreams to herself. Around this time, she began exploring acting. She took classes, studied scenes, and pushed herself into spaces where young black actresses were rarely invited. Hollywood and Broadway were not built for someone like her. Scripts were limited, roles were narrow, and expectations were even narrower. But she refused to shrink herself to fit someone else's vision. She took whatever small roles she could find and treated each one as if it mattered, because to her, it did. People noticed her discipline before they noticed her fame. Directors spoke about her calm intensity, the way she carried herself with quiet confidence, even when she was unsure inside. She was still figuring things out, still battling the doubt that had followed her since childhood, but she never backed away from the hard parts. Those early years were filled with long nights, missed opportunities, and moments when she questioned whether she belonged in such an unforgiving industry. But there were also flashes of hope, a glowing review, a door opening that had been closed before, a chance to stand in front of a new audience and prove herself. Slowly, step by step, she built the foundation of a career that would reshape the possibilities for women who looked like her. She didn't know it yet, but she was becoming a pioneer simply by insisting that she deserved a place in the room. Every song, every audition, every small victory pushed her closer to the moment when the world would finally see her not as a newcomer trying to fit in, but as a force who was meant to lead.
Breakthrough moment. Diahann's breakthrough didn't arrive with thunder or shock. It began quietly, like most of the important moments in her life. She had already spent years moving from one performance to the next, slowly building a reputation as a rare combination of talent and poise. But the moment that changed everything came when she auditioned for a role that seemed almost impossible for a black woman to win at the time. The project was the musical Carmen Jones. Hollywood was still deeply segregated, and opportunities for black performers were often limited to roles that reinforced stereotypes. But this film was different. It needed powerful, magnetic performers who could carry the entire story with their voices and presence. And when Diahann stepped into the room, she did exactly that. The producers were stunned. She wasn't just good, she was undeniable. Her performance in Carmen Jones brought her into national attention. Audiences who had never seen her before were suddenly talking about her elegance, her voice, the way she could appear fragile and strong in the same moment. She had a natural grace that made people look twice, but what truly set her apart was her quiet determination. She didn't try to imitate anyone. She brought her own truth into every scene. More roles followed, each one bigger than the last. But the real breakthrough came when she became the first black woman to star in her own American television series, Julia. That moment was more than a career milestone. It was a cultural shift. Viewers across the country saw a black woman on television who was not a maid, not a caricature, not a background character. She was a professional, a mother, and a fully realized human being. For millions of people who had never seen themselves reflected honestly on screen, this was revolutionary. But the significance of Julia wasn't just historical. It was deeply personal for Diahann. She felt the weight of expectation, the pressure of representing an entire community at a time when visibility was rare.
She carried that burden with dignity, even when it exhausted her. She knew what it meant for Black children to see her each week. She understood what it meant for Black women to finally feel seen. Her breakthrough wasn't one moment. It was a collision of timing, courage, and years of quiet perseverance. And when the world finally opened its eyes to her, she stepped forward not with arrogance, but with the steady confidence of someone who had spent her entire life preparing for this.
Peak career and golden era. Diann's rise into her golden era felt like the moment she had been preparing for since childhood. After years of pushing against closed doors, she suddenly found herself standing in the center of a spotlight that was finally bright enough to show the world what she had always carried inside. It was a time when her presence became larger than a single performance. She had become a symbol of what ambition could look like when paired with grace and relentless dedication. With Julia, she became a household name. People who had never thought deeply about race or representation suddenly found themselves admiring a Black woman who embodied intelligence, warmth, and professional strength. Letters poured in from mothers thankful for a role model, from young girls who saw their future reflected on screen for the first time, and from viewers who simply found comfort in her gentleness. The show ran for years, and every episode added another thread to the new fabric of American television. But her golden era was not confined to one role. Diann moved between film, television, and the stage with the ease of someone who understood that her talent did not belong to one medium. On Broadway, she commanded the stage with a presence that left audiences breathless. She earned a Tony Award for her performance in No Strings, becoming the first Black woman to win in the Best Actress category. That night, people in the theater felt as if they were witnessing history take shape. She stood under the warm stage lights, not as someone breaking barriers, but as someone who belonged there as much as anyone who came before her. Her voice, always a defining part of her identity, reached new heights during these years. She sang in packed halls, her voice carrying through the room with clarity and emotional honesty. Critics praised her as elegant, refined, and fearless. Yet beneath all the recognition, she remained disciplined and focused. She treated every performance as a responsibility. To her, excellence was not optional. It was the only way to honor the people who had never been allowed to dream the way she did. Success brought opportunities, but it also brought pressures she rarely spoke about. There were days when she felt trapped between the public's expectations and her own desire to grow. She knew she was seen as a trailblazer, but she also knew how heavy that title could feel. Still, she didn't allow herself to shrink. She learned to breathe through the criticism, the scrutiny, and the constant need to be perfect. Her golden era glowed not because everything was easy, but because she carried herself through every challenge with dignity. She showed the world that a Black woman could lead, could shine, could reshape an industry without asking for permission. And in doing so, she left a mark that would outlast any award or headline.
Personal life and hidden pain. Behind the glamour of her career, Diann's personal life was far more complex, shaped by moments of quiet struggle and emotional battles she often kept out of sight. The world looked at her and saw confidence and elegance. They saw a woman who seemed untouchable, perfectly composed, always poised. But the truth was far more human. Her success didn't erase her fears or protect her from heartbreak. It simply taught her how to hide it better. She experienced love in intense, consuming ways. Some relationships lifted her up, others left her feeling small and unsure of herself. She married several times, each union beginning with hope and ending with a different kind of sadness. Her relationship with singer Vic Damone was especially turbulent. Their romance carried passion, but it also carried tension, misunderstandings, and long stretches of emotional fatigue. She tried to make it work, tried to shape the chaos into something stable, but love is not always enough to fix the cracks that grow over time. Motherhood was a grounding force in her life. Her daughter Suzanne became her closest tether to the real world, a reminder that tenderness still existed beyond the demands of fame. Yet even motherhood came with its own pain. The pressure of balancing her public identity with private responsibilities created a constant internal tug-of-war. She often felt guilty for the moments she missed, the nights she spent working, the sacrifices that came with being the first to break barriers. One of her most private battles was her struggle with breast cancer. She carried that diagnosis with quiet bravery, refusing to let fear overshadow her life. She went through surgeries, treatments, and long silent nights where she questioned whether she would ever feel whole again. But instead of withdrawing, she became an advocate, speaking openly about her experience so other women would not feel alone. It was one of the most vulnerable and courageous acts of her life. Behind her polished exterior was a woman who longed for peace, who wrestled with the weight of expectations, who sometimes cried alone when the world wasn't watching. She loved deeply, hurt quietly, and kept moving forward even when she felt exhausted. Her hidden pain did not diminish her strength. It revealed it. Because through every heartbreak, every setback, and every private moment of doubt, she refused to surrender the life she had built. Her story reminds us that greatness does not shield anyone from suffering. It simply teaches them how to hold both triumph and pain without letting either one define them completely.
Turning point, decline. As the years unfolded, the pace of Diann's life began to slow, not abruptly, but in a gradual way that almost felt like a soft dimming of the lights. There was no dramatic fall, no single moment that marked her decline. Instead, it was the quiet passage of time, the shift of the industry, and the weight of her own battles that slowly reshaped her world. She remained admired, even cherished, but the roles that once came easily began to thin out. Hollywood was still hesitant to offer complex roles to older women, and even more reluctant when those women were black. She tried to keep working, accepting parts that interested her, appearing in shows that allowed her to stay connected to her craft, but she could feel the change. The industry she had fought so hard to break into was evolving in ways she couldn't control. Younger actors were rising, and new faces were capturing the attention she once held so firmly. She was proud of them, yet she couldn't ignore the small ache that came with being quietly replaced. At the same time, her health began to demand more of her attention. The cancer she had once fought returned, and this time it came with a heaviness that felt harder to outrun. She faced rounds of treatment that drained her energy. She endured long days marked by fatigue, discomfort, and an unwelcome awareness of her own fragility. Still, she pushed through, refusing to let the illness dictate her identity. She continued to make public appearances when she could, always presenting herself with the same grace that had defined her entire career. There were moments when she looked back at her past with both pride and sorrow. She had achieved more than she ever imagined, yet she also recognized how much she had sacrificed along the way. Her personal relationships had been difficult. Her emotional wounds had never fully healed. And as she navigated the latter years of her life, she carried those memories with her, not as regrets, but as reminders of the complexity of her journey. One of the most painful turning points came when she had to accept that her body no longer allowed her to perform the way she once did. For someone who had always found purpose in her work, stepping away felt like losing a part of herself. She missed the stage lights, the shared breath of an audience, the the sound of applause rising like a wave after a performance. She missed the feeling of belonging to something larger than herself. But even as her career slowed and her health declined, she remained resilient. She spoke openly about her struggles, especially her battle with cancer, because she believed her honesty could help others. She spent time with her family, allowing herself the softness she had often denied in her younger years. She found comfort in quieter routines, in simple conversations, and in the small acts of daily life that had once been overshadowed by work. Her decline was not a collapse. It was a gentle folding inward, a recognition that even the strongest lives eventually reach a point of surrender. But she met that surrender with dignity, carrying the same strength that had carried her through everything before.
Legacy and meaning. Diahann Carroll's legacy stretches far beyond the roles she played or the awards she won. It lives in the way she shifted the landscape for generations who followed. Before her, Hollywood had built a narrow vision of what a black woman could be on screen. Because of her, that vision widened. She proved that elegance, intelligence, vulnerability, and leadership were not traits reserved for others. They were hers as well. And by embodying them so fully, she changed the expectations of an entire industry. Her groundbreaking work on Julia became a blueprint for representation. It was the first time American television saw a black woman portrayed as a central figure with agency, dignity, and complexity. She became a symbol of possibility for children watching at home who had never seen themselves reflected in a positive light. Even today, actors speak openly about her presence, gave them permission to imagine careers they once thought were impossible. Her influence extended far beyond her screen achievements. She carried herself with an unshakable sense of self-worth, even when the world tried to diminish her. She demanded respect in spaces that were not built for her. She spoke with conviction about race, equality, and the realities of being a black woman in entertainment. She did all of it with a calm, measured tone that made people listen. Her advocacy work, especially her openness about her cancer diagnosis, helped countless women feel less alone. To younger artists, she became a mentor and a quiet source of strength. She never tried to shape people into her own image. Instead, she encouraged them to develop their own voices, their own sense of identity. She understood that her legacy would not be a single story, but a ripple effect, touching lives in ways she might never see. Her legacy is also deeply personal. Her daughter remembers her not as the glamorous star the world adored, but as the mother who tried, despite all the demands and pressures, to show love in the ways she understood. Friends describe her as thoughtful, honest, and deeply intuitive, someone who listened with genuine interest. These intimate pieces of her life are just as meaningful as the public achievements. Perhaps the greatest meaning of her story lies in its balance of triumph and vulnerability. Diahann Carroll was not perfect, nor did she pretend to be. She struggled with love, with identity, with illness, with the weight of expectations. But she continued to rise again and again, carrying her pain with quiet strength. Her legacy is the reminder that beauty is not just in the spotlight or in success. It is also in resilience. It is in truth. It is in a woman who dared to stand tall in a world that often asked her to shrink. Through her courage, she reshaped the future for countless others, and that will echo long after her name is spoken for the last time.
Closing reflection. Looking back on Diahann Carroll's life feels like watching a long ribbon unfurl, each section marked by struggle, brilliance, heartbreak, and courage. She lived in a world that did not make space for women like her, yet she carved out a path with such force that the world eventually had no choice but to widen. Her story is not simply about fame or talent,
It is about a woman who carried herself through both triumph and pain with a quiet kind of strength that never needed to announce itself. In reflection, her life feels like a lesson in resilience. She endured criticism, racism, personal heartbreak, and the heavy weight of expectation. She faced illnesses that threatened to silence her, yet she continued to speak. She kept walking when the road was steep, and she kept performing when the world expected her to retire into the background. She lived with an honesty that many admired but few understood, because she never pretended her journey was simple. She allowed the world to see her vulnerability, her fear, and her doubts, and in doing so, she became more than an icon. She became human. But what stands out most is the grace with which she navigated her life. Grace not in the sense of perfection, but in her ability to rise even when she felt broken. Grace in the way she treated people, even when she was exhausted or hurting. Grace in the way she embraced her own flaws and admitted her mistakes. She was never just an actress or a glamorous figure. She was a woman learning to survive in an unforgiving world, and she did so with a sense of dignity that never wavered. As the lights dim on her story, one cannot help but feel both a sadness and a deep sense of gratitude. Sadness that her voice is no longer present, that her presence no longer fills the rooms she once stepped into with such quiet power, but gratitude for everything she left behind, the roles she played, the barriers she broke, the truths she dared to speak, and the women she inspired without ever needing to raise her voice. Her legacy is stitched into the fabric of modern storytelling, woven into the careers of the actresses who now stand where once she stood alone. Her final years, though marked by illness, did not erase her brilliance. Instead, they made her humanity even more visible. She faced those years with the same honesty that defined her entire life. There was no dramatic farewell, no grand performance, only a woman embracing the final chapters of her story with the same determination that guided her through every previous one. In the end, she allowed herself to rest, something she had fought against for most of her life. And now, when people speak her name, they do so with a sense of reverence, not because she was perfect, but because she lived her life unapologetically. She was tender and fierce, vulnerable and unshakable. She carried beauty and sorrow in equal measure, and she taught the world that strength does not always roar. Sometimes it whispers. Sometimes it survives quietly in the background. Sometimes it simply refuses to disappear. Diahann Carroll's story reminds us that real greatness is not about applause or awards. It is about the battles fought when no one is watching. It is about the courage to remain truthful in a world built on illusions. It is about lifting others, even when carrying your own pain feels heavy. And it is about leaving behind a light that continues to glow long after the body that held it has faded. Her journey ends, but her influence does not. It lives on in every actress who sees herself reflected in the space Diahann created. It lives in every woman who finds strength in her vulnerability. And it lives in every story that dares to reach for deeper truths. In the end, her life was her greatest performance, and it remains unforgettable.